A long-lost Atari 2600 game has finally been discovered after 40 years. Hello, my name is Brendan, and this is Sunday Quickie. If you're not aware about Sunday Quickie, we take a look at topical and new events in the retro gaming sphere, and we do it with no script and no production values. I'm currently using a window to illuminate my face, which is probably why I'm wearing a hat. Today's topic, it actually got on Kotaku. Retro Atari game found after being lost for 40 years. Sonar is described as a toy version of Battleship. Toy version of Battleship. Isn't Battleship already a toy? Being a board game? Is a board game considered a toy? We can ponder that later. Anyway, this is a very cool story that's popped up within the last week. This used to happen a lot considering the age of Atari 2600, going back to the late 70s and early 80s. Probably about 10 to 15 years ago, just about every other week, it felt like a long-lost Atari 2600 prototype was being discovered and being dumped online, usually on the Atari Age forums. So I've covered a few of these videos in the past on my unreleased or unobtainable series of videos, which are much better than this series of videos, so go check them out if you're into this sort of stuff. This may possibly make a video for that. Be good enough for a video like that, I'm trying to say, but I don't know, it's pretty basic. There's not really much to the story, and I guess we can just delve into it today instead. So let me bring up my cheat sheet of information. So Sonar was developed in 1979, which is right at the beginning of the 2600, so this may have possibly been a launch title, I guess. So there's a great write-up about this on AtariProtos.com. Probably could work on the design of the website a little bit. Reading small light blue text on a black background isn't exactly that great for your eyes, but the information on the website is good nonetheless. So the star of this show is a programmer who worked at Atari. So this is actually from Atari itself, not a third-party developer, which didn't even really exist in the late 70s and early 80s. Regardless, his name was Brad Stewart, and he's notable for coding asteroids on the 2600. So this game, the idea, the knowledge of this game has been known about since way back in 2001. Brad Stewart was in an interview, and I can't seem to find the source for this interview. I don't know where it was or if it's still available to read. So if you know, please let me know. I'd love to read it. But he mentioned this game, well, he mentioned a Battleship-like game, and he mentioned another game that was never released called Morse Code Tutor, and that was discovered in 2014. So no one really knows the reason why it wasn't released. When we get into the more technical reasons of how the game plays, it will probably be a bit more apparent. But regardless, development was dropped. He went to go work on other projects instead. And he didn't have it in his own collection, which is what he said in the 2001 interview. So jump forward to last year, and there was an engineer who worked in the R&D department of Atari named Jim Schneider. Now, unfortunately, Jim died last year, but a man named, and I'm probably going to butcher this, so sorry in advance, but Alvaro, let's just call him Alvaro, because I'm pretty confident I'm saying Alvaro correctly. Regardless, he met Jim Schneider's daughter very shortly before Jim passed on. And his daughter told him that he had lots of just old stuff from back in the day when he worked at Atari and beyond. Apparently, sadly, a lot of it had already been thrown away, but his daughter tried to donate it to a museum as per Jim's wishes before he died, and apparently the museum wouldn't take it. Maybe she just didn't explain herself properly of what was actually within this collection, but luckily a man named, I already said his name, Alvaro. Sorry, I'm running around in circles here a little bit, but basically Alvaro obtained this stuff, saved it from the landfill, and he's dumped it on the Atari Age forums for us to all enjoy. So, pretty cool story. As I said, not much to it. Like some of the other Atari prototypes have very in-depth stories and are usually entwined with lots of mystery and sometimes backstabbing, a lot of drama around these old gaming cartridges. Luckily, it doesn't really seem to be the case here, but here is what it looks like, question mark, 1979. It looks like a prototype cartridge, and here are some screenshots. So like I said, it is very much like battleships, but we'll go into the gameplay in a moment. But here is the thread. Everything I'm showing here will be linked down below. It's on this Atari Age thread. It's where you can download the ROM, and it plays in an emulator I use called Stella, which seems to be the, the top shelf version of any Atari 2600 emulator, at least from what I've tried. So basically, the guy who wrote up this, he's made this post, and he uploaded the prototype. But there were some issues with the prototype, which I believe are listed here. So although Sonar is an almost complete prototype, there are still a few bugs and missing features in the game. The biggest bug is that if the player has the difficulty switch set in the A position, which is the full Sonar scan, which will make sense in a second, the screen will briefly roll due to the kernel using too much CPU time. The display will quickly fix itself, but the constant flickering makes the game hard to play. The second issue is that the ships and mines are not randomized. There is only one pre-programmed map that is always used. By looking at the game code, it would appear the randomized boards were planned, but the feature had not yet been implemented when the game development was stopped. So, Atari Age, great community, to the rescue. If we scroll down a bit in the thread, here it is. I've highlighted it here. Let me just unhighlight it so it doesn't look... How do I even... Disable highlighter. Oh, that didn't work. Whatever, doesn't matter. It's not supposed to be pink. That's just been me, so I can find it easily. But basically, we have forum member Thomas, and I'm probably going to butcher this poor guy's last name too. Jensk? I don't know. I'm really bad at pronouncing names. My name's Brendan. It's as Irish as it gets. Our names are very easy to pronounce, so much respect. Anyway, he has created, basically, he's a homebrew developer, it appears, and he fixed those issues. So he said there was memory free on there. And interestingly, he said that there was code for Adventure on there as well. And he actually found some graphics that cannot be found in the final game from Adventure. So there's walking birds and a chalice. So obviously it doesn't look much there, but that's cool. That's a discovery within a discovery. But basically, he fixed it, so he got rid of the scrolling, he got rid of the stereo, which is a very important aspect of the game, which we'll get into in a second. And yeah, he made it randomized as well, which is probably the main thing that people wanted. So he's also uploaded here, only 240 people have downloaded, including myself. It's all fixed, ready to go, which is awesome. So Thomas, you're great. But let's talk about the game itself. So there is a bit of a description here, I guess. So basically the interesting aspect of Sonar. So think about Battleship. When you're playing the board game Battleship, obviously you can't see the other players' playing field. The thing folds out. One of them's facing this way, one of them's facing this way. You put the ships, you try the coordinates, and you try and sink their battleships. It's like, the fog of war. Basically, the idea behind Sonar is that it would use stereo speakers to create pings, and you would try and discover where the opponent's ships were by the pings. Kind of like how they did it in real life, I guess. But basically, Atari 2600 games aren't usually in stereo. They're mostly in mono. Most TVs in the 1980s were mono. So the way they were going to work around this was have speakers that actually were in the Atari 2600 itself, and apparently mounts for these speakers still exist in the Heavy Sixer version of the 2600 console, although obviously Atari decided not to go down this route. That's probably the main reason this game was cancelled. But it's pretty interesting. So basically the computer is creating the playscape, and it's like, obviously it was supposed to randomize it. In the original prototype it doesn't, but now it does thanks to old mate Thomas. And basically it's a 2-player game, so when you see gameplay of this, I'm quite literally playing myself, which isn't much of a challenge or very fun. But you scroll around and you try and drop these depth charges, and as you're moving your boat around, each player has a different type of ping, and you try and figure out by the pings. So it's a bit of a novel approach, really, and it means that it can be played all on the same screen. So yeah, pretty cool, I think. And it isn't just like a rush of running around, dropping charges, whoever gets there first sort of thing. There is some thought out game modes for it. So by default, you're on like the limited charges, so you can only drop 5 charges at a time. And if the other player hasn't dropped 5 yet, you have to wait until they've done that, and then you can both drop another 5. So it kind of slows down the game. Otherwise, you'd just be probably going around in a grid trying to, just trying to be lucky, basically. There's also a miss penalty mode where each time a player bombs an empty square, it costs them 2 points. So that sort of stops you, makes you a bit more selective in the way you drop your charges as opposed to just going full hole. There's also an invisible mode where the board isn't marked at all, like the squares don't change colors when you drop a charge. So yeah, you have to try and remember where you've dropped a square or not. That sounds pretty horrible. Like my memory is really bad for that sort of thing, so I'd play miserably in that mode. Lastly, we have the mines mode. So there are mines hidden on the board as well as the ships. So if you bomb a hidden mine instead of a boat, you lose 5 points. So there is actually quite a bit to it. It is an interesting concept. And 1979, there's a very good chance it could have been a launch title, but I'm going to guess the reason that they got rid of the inbuilt stereo speakers, that has to be the main reason. I just don't see how they would get around that with mono televisions. Like, when did stereo televisions come in? Like, commonly, like early 90s? I don't know. I had a TV from the early 90s that was stereo, but that was like an expensive TV from what I can gather. So yeah, I would say that is the reason. But otherwise, there isn't really much to say about Sonar. As you can see in the game, it is very simple, but it's cool that it exists. And I think that's ultimately why I decided to make this a Sunday quickie as opposed to an unreleased or unobtainable. And traditionally, Atari 2600 stuff doesn't really seem to perform very well. So yeah, that's the reason I did a Sunday cookie. No one asked, but that's the reason why. So that's Sonar. So we're done with Sonar. I just want to quickly add a bit about my releasing schedule at the end of this video for those who care. So if you don't, you can just click off and watch something better. As some of you know, I went on a holiday to Melbourne and had a great time. So my release schedule has been a little bit off. I did release a video on Bartronica, which was a gaming arcade bar I visited. So not many people watched that, and I didn't think many people would, considering most of my audience are Americans, but that's sort of the reason the schedule has been a bit all over the place. The other reason is I'm working on a pretty big project, a new episode of Wonders of the Retro Gaming World. So that should be out next weekend. The research phase is done. It's now in the scripting phase, so I'm confident I'll get it out. I'm also, so it's going to be on the VM Labs Nuon, which was was it a DVD player that played games, or was it a video game console that played DVDs? Who knows? Watch the video and find out. I've also integrated some cool 3D visualization stuff into it. I was big into 3D visualization before I started YouTube. Been getting back into it now, learning Blender. So I did this with the last episode of Wonders of the Retro Gaming World on the Nintendo PlayStation prototype. Seemed to go down pretty well, so I've done it again for the new one. So has added a bit of time to the project, as well as all the usual, it's very time intensive to make those videos. It's why I only sort of make a couple a year, but hoping to make more. I've got a big master list of Wonders of the Retro Gaming World videos I want to make. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thank you for watching this particular video. I'll see you next time.